Post-Catastrophe Supply Chain Resilience is Aram Sahakian from the Emergency Department of the City of Los Angeles and Dr. Ken Hudnut from Caltech and the U.S. Geological Survey.
What a golden voice. Good afternoon. So both the doctor and I have been tasked to kill your sugar buzz. Hopefully you had a great lunch. I did. We were both thrilled to get invited to speak to you today because the topic is so important, both to us, it's what we do, to the city, and also to the supply chain family. Am I changing the slides? How is this working? Who's doing the slides? You're doing the slides. Okay. So, and I'm going to jump right into it, and the reason for that is we have only half an hour, so between me, the doctor, it's about 20 minutes, and then we're going to allow time for you to ask questions, and we'll probably have quite a few questions, so 10 minutes for questioning at the end, and we'll try our best to respond. So about 3 years ago, we embarked on a study to study supply chain resiliency. It was led by Carol Parks. She's sitting in front. Stand up quickly. And a team of interns, Sarah Lee, please stand up. And Sarah, she prepared the slide presentation today, and I apologize if I don't follow it. So, but she did a great job. We also had people from the private sector. We partnered with FEMA on technical assistance. The study research won awards, I believe 3 of them. It was presented to local and national audiences. And I can tell you right now, almost on a weekly basis, I get calls from major big cities to see how they can also engage in the process. So the study is about resiliency. It sought to understand the private sector capacity during a disaster. And I'll give you an example. Hurricane Sandy. The government was able to deliver 1.3 million cases of groceries. One grocery sector was able to deliver 16 million, and they were not at maximum capacity. So that gives you an idea of where the resources are. I mean, we like it or not, 88, 90+% of the resources are out there with you guys. Now, we need to work together to ensure continuity if there's a disaster, but it's out there. So we wanted to incorporate supply chain resiliency. I wanted to make sure that when I plan for disaster, you're at the table. You need to be at the table. Otherwise, not only recovery, but response will fail. And we'll get into that. And Ken, let me know if I'm talking too much here. We have a timeline right there. So we need to know what is supply chain resiliency, and very quickly for me, it's continuity of operations. During normal times, during normalcy, everything is smooth and sailing, right? 90+%, 95% plus. There's always glitches here and there. So imagine if we disrupt that, and not only one failure point, I throw 5, 6 different failure points at you. And it will have a chain effect. If you're talking about groceries, well, are these perishable goods? If you're talking about medical supplies going to hospitals, pharmaceutical supplies going to hospitals, what's happening with the patients? And we're talking about a major disaster, and the doctor will touch on that a little later, and he'll paint a good picture because we're going to face it one day, unfortunately. So the goal was to identify the key distributors. And the study, by the way, concentrated on 6 sectors. And these sectors, all 6 of them, and we'll talk about that a little later, are critical to any catastrophe. They're the lifeline to survive a major catastrophe. So we needed to understand where the distributors, retailers are located, where the distribution points are, how things are moving back and forth, the transportation channels, if you guys have planned for it or not. And we wanted to know how you can maximize your capacity. Because post-disaster, you will have to maximize your capacity. And again, we'll talk about that. At this point, I'm going to pass it to you, Doctor, and you will talk about...
So as Aram said, we're here to kill that sugar buzz. I guess you could call us the Buzzkill Brothers. Yeah, we're like the little dark cloud floating in and kind of raining on the parade here. But I'd like to talk too about how there could be a silver lining in all of that, because by raising awareness and talking about this problem, as Nick posed it, one of the objectives of this whole effort is to identify and then solve problems. And I think that's very realizable, because here we can identify the natural hazards threat matrix, essentially. We can then work together to prioritize those corrective actions that need to be taken to reduce risk. So it can be managed, and the risk can be reduced, so that we can keep within that range of, say, disaster response and recovery, and it doesn't necessarily need to slip down into that range of catastrophic response and recovery. Now, we work together, and as Aram mentioned, with the state, well, actually with the County of Los Angeles, the state, and also the federal government. And there's a very well-oiled machine there, and we operate on a concept called incident command. This is bottom-up requests coming from the field level up through chain of command, and then those requests being fulfilled. So when we have a disaster, that response is based on repetitive muscle movement of the whole community of responders. And so that just works really well. Not all countries all around the world do it that same way, but this is a principled system that was developed here in response to one wildfire after another in Southern California. We have a lot of disasters hitting Southern California, you probably noticed, and, but this same idea has been shifted eastward and is also used for major storm responses back there. And so we find that it scales really well. But part of that whole cycle of planning and then doing exercises and after-action reporting to tune up the process, updating those plans, we literally do work together on updating the Southern California Catastrophic Earthquake Response Plan, and then we would put that into effect in case of a major earthquake, which we'll get into talking about here. But how do we boil it down and take a look at what really matters? We look at this intersection that you see here between hazards and humans. You can have humans where there's no natural hazard and there's no risk there. And contrarily, you can have hazards where there are no humans and no risk there. So we're looking intentionally at those intersection points where natural hazards intersect with either dense population centers like our megacities, which also tend to be ports. We also look at where lifelines cross major faults like the San Andreas Fault. So we look at places like Cajon Pass, which is on the I-15 out in San Bernardino County. But that place is where most of the goods movement that you're all quite familiar with, that goods movement is going by rail out of the LA basin and out to the rest of the country. So right there is the intersection point where the San Andreas Fault crosses those major lifelines for goods movement. So we can focus our attention, just like you would direct a satellite to take an image of a particular area of interest, or just like you would focus with a microscope on a problem. And that lets us zoom in on where the risk is extraordinarily high. Another example, of course, is where the coastline intersects the Alameda Corridor at the ports of LA and Long Beach. So we can zoom in on that, look at it and break it down, look at the natural hazards, threats, look at those risks, and then prioritize and take action accordingly. So one great thing about working with the city of LA in particular is the leadership of Mayor Garcetti. He supports what is being done through the Emergency Management Department, but also through all of its partners, as I said, county, state, federal partners. And we recognize, though, as Aram was saying about the Superstorm Sandy response, that it's not It's really not all about government response. That's one fraction of the total response. And this has been recognized to a greater and greater degree with every big disaster, Katrina, Sandy. You know, we look at the earthquake problem here in California, and one of the issues we have is that it's been a while since we've had a big earthquake. So when we talk about the earthquake threat, we talk about the statewide earthquake threat. It's really both LA and San Francisco that are the major ports, the major cities, San Diego as well. But when you look at the threat to California, you see that big red stripe going diagonally up. That's the San Andreas Fault. So we consider the hazards, the threats to be statewide, and we try to approach that collectively together. So San Francisco and LA work together in partnership, and we realize that we'll be the ones that are helping each other out after that future disaster strikes as well. It's not only the San Andreas Fault, though, and let me just explain a little bit here on this slide about how this all works. Imagine North America to the northeast of that slide. Just imagine that it's pinned down to the surface of the Earth. The Pacific Plate, meaning underneath the Pacific Ocean, the rock that's beneath there, is moving toward the northwest, going in the direction of Alaska at a rate of 2 inches per year. And that plate tectonic movement just isn't ever going to stop. We can't stop it. You can get a bumper sticker that says "Stop Plate Tectonics," but it doesn't actually work. We've tried. But so that is steadily applying stress to the whole system, and the only thing that can relieve that stress is big earthquakes. So you're, I'm sure, all familiar with the 1906 Great San Francisco earthquake, also the fire that followed it, devastating. San Francisco was able to rise from the ashes and come back as a great city. Probably fewer of you are familiar with the 1857 big one on the San Andreas down here in Southern California. There were only about 4,000 people living in LA at that time. And it wasn't very disruptive. There were only, the tallest buildings were 2-story. And so since then, we've developed this incredible city. And we have now in the LA basin, city of LA alone is 4 million, and the basin is about 16 million people. And along with all of these people, we have this tremendous infrastructure now. And that infrastructure, that city is at risk, not only from earthquakes. Some of the things that we see associated with earthquakes we'll talk a little bit more about as well, but secondary effects can also be extremely important. We saw that in Katrina with the failure of the levee. Examples like that are important to consider, but also harder to foresee. So we don't have a clear crystal ball. We don't know exactly what will happen in the future, but we do know pretty well what has happened in the past and even in prehistoric time. I want to show you on the left here the Northridge earthquake and what we call a shake map. So in the San Fernando Valley, those of you that are not from around here, I'll just give you a little bit of a geography starter on this, but the San Fernando Valley is where the Northridge earthquake struck the hardest, and that is part of the city of Los Angeles. And you can see where it's red there. That fault that ruptured moved about 8 feet in about 10 seconds on the fault plane, but the fault plane didn't come up to the ground surface, and it caused shaking, widespread shaking, but those of us in the earthquake business don't see that as a major hit because it was kind of more like a glancing blow to the edge of the urban area, frankly. And yet there was $40 billion in total damage from that. Over 60 people were killed. Now, when we look to the future, we use the past and the prehistoric evidence as our guide. And so here on the right, we're looking at a big one that could happen someday in the future. We call this our shakeout scenario. It's a magnitude 7.8. And so what we were trying to address is the needs of the stakeholder community that we work with. Emergency managers came to us and said, we really need to be able to visualize what you all are talking about when you say the big one. And so we want to do exercises, and in order to do that, we need to have a more of a broken down, like step by step, here's what would happen in a big urban earthquake. So we went through a process of developing this detailed shakeout scenario. And as you can see on the right, that pattern of shaking is much, much more widespread. When the Northridge earthquake hit, Afterwards, the power was out, but it was restored relatively quickly. Same with the water and other basic important utilities. You could literally drive some distance away and get gas and go to a fast food restaurant to eat, and then drive home and shelter in place. We're not so sure how the response will go after a bigger earthquake, so this is why the supply chain study was conducted by the Emergency Management Department of the City of LA, was to look in more detail at some of the impacts expected from this shakeout scenario. And Aram is going to show you some of those results and come back to a zoomed-in part of this map that's on the right, and you'll see how, even though this earthquake is on the San Andreas, which is on the other side of the mountains from LA, it causes strong shaking throughout the LA area. So he's going to show how that would impact supply chains here. We are constantly looking at earthquakes all around the world to see what kinds of impacts occur. Myself and a team went to Haiti after the earthquake there because people all want to know what's going to happen next. Is it possible that we could have an even larger earthquake closer to Port-au-Prince? And so it's an important thing. This also was the big question on people's minds after the Gorka, Nepal earthquake. So our office is located at Caltech. We do all the earthquake monitoring for Southern California, but we also have pulled in a great talent pool there, people that study earthquakes all around the world. And so as part of that, we try to understand what kinds of disruption will occur in a big earthquake. And so we look to these examples all around the world. This is from the New Zealand earthquake that occurred recently, and it shows the disruption to transportation. I chose this of hundreds of photographs showing similar disruption to transportation. Rail lines are often offset and need to be repaired, and that takes precious time. We understand that the disruption to goods movement is the kind of interruption that is intolerable, and so the mayor and others all up and down through the whole chain of how the response would occur understand the fundamental importance of goods movement. We understand when you show us numbers like $300 billion per year, and we understand, okay, ag in California is a very large economic sector, but it's only $36 billion, much, much less. And then when we look to Hollywood or say the aerospace industry, those are even lower than all of agriculture in California. And so we get it that goods movement is key. So people will immediately zero in on the places where important infrastructure like the ports, like the Alameda Corridor, that those get repaired as a top priority. Other things that can occur, I mentioned secondary impacts, and these can be extraordinarily important. We recognize in advance that fire following earthquake will be extremely important. We see this after major earthquakes all around the world. We saw this after Northridge, 1994, and in the Bay Area, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. That also had fire following earthquake. They almost reached a tipping point in that case, but because they had a backup water system, especially for firefighting, they were able to extinguish the number of fires they had, and they were able to keep things under control. This shows a refinery fire that occurred at a great distance from the magnitude 9 Japan earthquake of 2011. And in this case, some of the catalytic fluids needed to refine fuel are explosive. Also, some are dangerous acids. So there's potential for toxic plumes as well. There can be air quality issues when there are fires burning at refineries especially. There can also be hazmat plumes. So think about it, though, as how can we identify and then reduce those risks? I would pose to you that just about anything that we can imagine could go wrong is something that can be managed. And so if it's identified as a priority, then you can apply basic principles, bring in engineers to design retrofits to existing lifeline infrastructure and make it so that that fault movement or shaking can be withstood by the infrastructure, by the buildings. And I'll just leave you with this one example of a tremendous success in terms of earthquake countermeasures, and that is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. When it was built, they were required to take into account the presence of a fault right underneath the Trans-Alaska Pipeline called the Denali Fault. They brought in a team of geologists to say, okay, right here is where the fault zone is, and this is the amount of movement we expect could take place in a future earthquake. They said 20 feet laterally, 5 feet vertically. The engineers came in and designed a special slider system so that the pipe could ride out the shaking and accommodate the fault movement. And it was a brilliant design. It didn't cost very much more when they initially built it. They put Teflon on top of railroad track underneath that section of pipe so that the whole thing could slide. In 2002, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake occurred on that fault, as had been expected, and the engineering design worked beautifully, so not a single drop of oil was spilled. I talked to the engineers after the fact. They told me that, coincidentally, they were in the process of renewal of their permission to operate the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the one and only Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And they said that if even one single drop of oil had been spilled, they almost certainly would have not received permission to continue to operate that pipeline. So for them, it was game-changing to have done that risk reduction in advance, and I would contend that we can do that in almost every case, and we can ensure goods movement even after a very serious future earthquake. So that's a goal. I wanted to put that out there as a challenge to the group. It's one where a lot of work does need to be done, but I think that we can work together, as Nick said, to identify this problem, manage and reduce the risk as a team effort, and I think it would be a great thing that if we can do that together. Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Aram.
Thank you, Ken. And that's exactly what we want to do with supply chain. We want to start mitigating now. Federal government level all the way to the local level, we tend to spend money in the recovery phase without considering the cost to benefit ratio of $1 to $4, $5, up to $10 if we mitigate. What's more important is that lives will be dependent in this instance. So the slide you're looking at speaks volume. These are the very critical goods and services that are needed during and post the disaster. And I'm going to go very briefly and discuss the findings of each one of them. So the first one is the grocery sector, then you have the pharmaceuticals, transportation, fuel, water, and medical goods. So let's start with the pharmaceuticals. The findings showed that 3 major players in LA, and they all use the same distribution centers. They're co-located. And the locations of these centers are prone to major shaking during earthquakes. The medical goods. I don't know if you guys know, hospitals are good if they're prepared for only 72 hours. And then they have to rely on disaster response centers to come to the rescue. Well, research showed that those disaster response centers might not have the capacity because they need to increase capacity based on the number of patients, based on hospital activities. So another critical lifeline. Transportation, I come from a transportation background, Northridge earthquake. I was in the field for those of you who know, a collapse of the 10 freeway, the 118 freeway, we had a collapse on it, the Balboa Bridge, major disruption. And it takes time to fix these major highways, these disaster response routes. So we need to include that in our disaster planning now. The last mile, what we call the last mile, is done 88% of the time with trucking. And we know that debris removal is going to be a big issue after a major earthquake. So we need to work together now to plan it, to map it out, to see how and where your grid system is, and to include those routes on our disaster routes. So, and prioritize debris removal so your distribution centers are up and running. Without any hesitation, the second major transportation mean will be air transportation. It's going to be essential. Now, we are having an exercise with the military. It's during Fleet Week that's coming up. It's a DISCA exercise. It's defense support to civilian authorities, because we also need to use the ports to bring in assistance. Fuel, diesel and Jet A, extremely important. We have local refineries, but I can guarantee you, and probably the doctor will too, that they will be out of commission for 2 to 3 weeks. And the pipeline infrastructure that's under our major highways is aging. It's not where it's supposed to be. So it's going to get disrupted. So it's extremely important to make sure that we have the capacity to bring in the fuel, because and by the way, all these are interconnected. I mean, if you think of it, you don't have fuel, the trucks are not moving, the trains are not moving, right? If you don't have water, your employees are not going to be able to survive. And we're talking a major disaster. And let's discuss water quickly. Again, our water system in Los Angeles, the infrastructure is aging. I believe, average, if I'm not mistaken, couple of main ruptures every 2-3 days that we need to fix. It takes billions of dollars to fix the infrastructure. We recommend that businesses are prepared for 7 days, not 72 hours. The research showed that we rely on one company to deliver bottled water. It's not realistic. It's not going to happen. And most importantly, what we learned in the process is that we're not prepared for it. We're in a comfort zone. When I say we, I mean our communities, our business communities. We have a business operations center. Brent is sitting right there, reaching out to the businesses through the Chamber of Commerce and other means to make sure that the businesses are preparing for the next unexpected. And the last sector is the grocery sector, and we did spend more time on the grocery sector. We had to pick one, honestly, because we didn't have enough personnel resources. And yes, this is a call for assistance from anyone who is willing to support our internship program. We need to do more study. We have scratched the surface. We have a lot of work to do. But what we learned in the grocery sector is that 64% of the groceries that are moving from the distribution centers to the storefronts, to your Ralphs and Vons and the storefronts, are distributed by one major distributor. You have only a limited number of distributors. And unfortunately, the points of distributions, and you see the map there, and those are the circles, are located in San Bernardino and Riverside counties, where we expect to sustain major damage. So they're going to get impacted right off the get-go. And you can probably read, the points of distributions and the storefronts, the names on there. We can share this slide with you later. And again, I'm going to say that research showed that we are not preparing for a disaster. We're in a comfort zone and coasting. Business is as usual. But if you look at global warming, if you look at the natural disasters, the numbers are going up, and that's the trend. And we need to take this seriously. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I was so thrilled when Nick invited us to come and talk to you, because we need to hold hands. It's as simple as that. We need to start planning together. I can help you only if you can help me. Does it going to take funding and resources? Yes, it is going to take that. But it's also going to save lives. It's going to ensure continuity of operations after major disasters. And it boils down to employee preparedness. And I say this in my division the whole time too, because if your employees are not prepared, If their families at home are not prepared, guess what? They're not coming to work. And if your truck driver is not at work, your goods are not being delivered. You look at Katrina, 95% of the workforce, law enforcement agency, and first responders were lost within the first 24 hours. So to ensure that, you need to invest in your employees. You need to make sure that they meet a specific performance measure, so they have a peace of mind knowing that their families, their kids at home are safe and they can be at work helping your operations. So if we can go to the next slide, what we have learned from each other. I got 39 seconds, so I'm going to start wrapping it up. So at this point, what I need to do at my end and what I'm doing is that when I activate the Emergency Operations Center at post a major disaster, we have different levels of activations. I need to ensure that you're there with me at the table. And I need to ensure that I can give you the resources you need to continue your operations. But I can only do that if you have a plan to continue your operations. That could be from managing resources. It could be protection details needed for delivery of goods. It could be anything. It could be communications. So I need to ensure you're at the table, but you need to ensure that you have a plan in place. I'm going to end with that so we can, do we have time for questions? I think we went through the 30 minutes, right? Well, Ken, you want to take a couple of questions? Couple of questions maybe? Thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time.
I just wanted to ask whether you're familiar with the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, Allen, American Logistics Aid Network established after Hurricane Katrina. It's basically logistics providers all over the country have volunteered their equipment people and so forth to provide logistics support during disasters. Additionally, they've got a really outstanding simulation game where you get a large group of people together and go through all the decision-making and reactions that occur after a major disaster, and it's really enlightening to create a higher level of awareness and of what some of the crises are going to be and the challenges of dealing with them. And I think it's a good way of engaging members of the community to get more involved in disaster recovery.
No, absolutely. The goal is once we start zeroing in on each sector, identifying the gaps and thinking of way to mitigate them, the goal is to bring in the group of people in charge of that sector and to do tabletop exercises, play the what-if scenarios. We are familiar with them. We do have mega contracts in place. We had a marathon meeting with 2 mega contractors for different supplies, debris removal, services and goods. Yes, we are looking at lessons learned around the globe, actually, because we need to. But thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you.
Again, on behalf of the City of Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti and my General Manager, Aram Sahakian, we appreciate you listening to the presentation today. And please realize that this is just the very beginning. We are looking forward to more strategic partnerships with the private sector because as government, we don't have all the answers, but we need your information and we need to network with you. So on the website there, if you're interested in becoming a partner, with us so that we can advance the studies today, we invite you to go to the website. There is a link on our supply chain resiliency project. Give us your contact information and we will be in touch with you. Thank you very much.
I just saw this presentation, and I think we need to sell our home and move out of Southern California. No, I'm serious. It's scary. Okay, well, we'll talk more when I get home, all right? Okay, I gotta get back to work. All right, bye. Sorry about that. Wow, okay. You know, it also reminded me of another presidential quote. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And yeah, look, we got to be prepared, and the call is there for us to help. So let's take advantage of it. Okay, anyway, thanks again, Aram and Ken. Great presentation, mildly terrifying. No fake news there. Next up, we have the plenary omni-channel retail panel moderated by Clint Crawford. Please join me in welcoming the panelists.